Good day, lads and laddies. Welcome to our first debriefing on VOX-OPS. Alright, so Alpha 2 Phase 1 test weekend just finished, and holy cow. Let's go over some of the details that we got over this past weekend. There's a lot to unpack. So, first off, let's go over initial impressions. Well, honestly, loading into the game, there was a ton of lag. Line hold was an absolute mess with hundreds of players running around me, most of them stuck in place. Luckily, when I loaded in, I actually didn't disconnect on load, so that was actually quite a nice little thing. I actually had played in the pre-Alpha 2 NDA test the day before, so I pretty much loaded in, picked up all of my weaponry right off the bat, bolted to the middle of line hold, got the beginning of the lumberjack quest, so that way I could lumberjack as needed, and I left. Didn't complete the mining quest, didn't complete the herbalism quest. Just wanted to get out of line hold. I knew that the bottleneck was preventing other players from logging in, and it was so laggy. It was a terrible experience. I just wanted to get out. The NPC quest, I gotta say, did have a bit of an odd voice, but for the most part, actually, I enjoyed that there was a sound instead of just a dialogue box. I think it needs a lot of work, but just having a sound in the background when I click on the dialogue box was something that I found kind of enjoyable. All right, let's talk about the combat system and general PvP encounters. The combat in Ashes of Creation for me was stellar. I thoroughly enjoyed the combat sounds. I thoroughly enjoyed the NPCs. And, while they needed some work with their AI, their targeting acquisition was a bit rough at times. And their ability cast and pathing were definitely in need of work. The overall design of the AI and the enemies in general in Ashes was super engaging. I loved having to use my entire group to attack mobs. I loved how the time to kill for each mob was, 10-ish seconds, and it really felt like each mob had a lot of meaning to it. And depending on the mob, if you're attacking some of those 2 or 3 star mobs, you could really have a minute or longer fight duration depending on what you were doing. I really enjoyed all of that. I thought that was some really enjoyable gameplay. I didn't enjoy, of course, was the glitches and issues I had. Like the active block, a lot of times you'll still take the full damage, or you'll fail to block something that you were clearly blocking for. And then the tank also has an ability that you press to block and reflect incoming damage. And even when reflecting the damage, you still take the full damage. So in that regard, combat needs some work. I think a lot of those issues were primarily driven from the network side of things. There was definitely some replication issues. In fact, I would say the majority of the issues that I encountered were replication issues. Like, if you notice, actually, when you were running around on your mounts, most of the time, you wouldn't see other people running on their mounts. Then, in addition, even if you went to areas that were lower player density and your mounts would actually be properly loaded in, if you actually press the spacebar, your mount would rear up and do a really cool animation. Yeah, that doesn't replicate on anyone else's video. I learned that actually when I wanted to take a cool video snapshot of my guild doing it on a mountaintop, and not one of them showed it on the screen. So, yeah. The replication has a lot of issues, and the combat itself, though, it's really fun. It's definitely a good time, very enjoyable. I would like to know, what do you guys like about the combat? Was it something that you guys enjoyed, having the longer time to kill? I know there's been a lot of debate about how, mobs should interact, how long leveling should take, but overall, the combat engagement, how did you enjoy being a bard or a cleric or a tank or the DPS of your group? I know a lot of people mentioned mana regen being an issue. Do you think that increasing the mana regen is something that you actually want? Because you have to remember that increasing the mana regen might negate a lot of the value of a bard, for example. And one of the core design philosophies of Ashes is having that group gameplay focus, and bard being part of that group. So maybe there's another way to augment the player's mana regen a little better. I know we'll have access to potions in the future, and that'll help. Of course, rations will assist, but that's only out of combat. And you know, of course, managing the number of pulls that you have and how fast you're pulling is always an important aspect. You know, what's the right balance? I think right now it might be a tad low, but I'm very hesitant to encourage Intrepid to increase that, because if they increase it too much, I could very easily see the value of the Bard's mana regen and other mana regen abilities going down enough that, you know, the build choice diversity goes down overall. One of the most interesting points for me was definitely the node system. I loaded into the game, ran straight Joeva, and Joeva at the time when I arrived was level 1, which I just thought was super cool. There's no node there, and leveling it did happen extremely quickly, which, you know, I would like to see slowed down in the future. Of course, I know it's an alpha 2, so that will happen regardless. But leveling the node for me was extremely satisfying. I can't wait until I can get that node to level 6, and it takes me a month or two to do so. I think it's super satisfying when I'm farming XP in an area that doesn't just apply to XP from myself or my party, but also applies to my node. It just feels really good. It makes me feel valuable more so than just my character. It like a cog in a larger machine in all the best ways. You know, when I was farming those nodes or farming in that node, I definitely really enjoyed watching it grow. When it went from 1 to 2, watching the tents appear and all the NPCs kind of gathered around a campfire and stuff, that was super cool. Then watching that go from 2 to 3, where you have real big actual wooden buildings with walls around the settlement, I thoroughly enjoyed that aspect of the game. You know, I'm looking forward to seeing caravans being deployed to actually level the buildings inside of a node. And I love the idea of being able to upgrade like the castle defenses of the node, because, you know, imagine transporting 15,000 stone to upgrade the walls of your settlement from wood to stone. I think that's just an awesome design mechanic. So looking forward to it. You know, for future expectations, I gotta say, Ashes of Creation has a lot to work on. You know, they're definitely not polished in any way. They definitely don't even have the baseline netcode up to allow us to have a smooth experience. That being said, the experience was still the best one I've had in a game in a long time. I don't remember the last time I played any video game for as long as I did this past weekend. I mean, it's been years, and I think that tells a lot to me in terms of the value of what they're providing. The game bones are what's important, and they have those. Future expectations, I expect them to work on that netcode, which is, you know, obviously the core priority. I want to see the combat have a more fleshed out design where, you know, mechanics aren't getting dropped constantly because of probably the code of the network. I want to see mobs not getting stuck and having way better pathing. Also, their aggro mechanics are dog shit. Holy cow. I cannot stand watching a mob get stuck on a wall, constantly running through and around an enemy that it just doesn't make sense. So the pathing is horrible. Additionally, I think that there's a lot of ways to gamify and exploit the mob AI, which, you know, I understand that's an alpha. I'm glad we're finding it now. I definitely hope that they spend a lot of time making sure that on full launch, those kind of exploits don't happen a lot. I know they said they will. We'll see if they take, you know, we can take them at their word for that. That'll take some time, so we'll see. I think another of my big issues, there was two primary glitches inside of the game that really made it difficult to play. The first one was the storage system in Ashes. You occasionally couldn't place your inventory into the storage or withdraw from the storage, which basically prevented you from utilizing the crafting system, which was super frustrating because you'd be spending all this time crafting, you'd get these really nice drops, you know, rare or epic or anything else, and you would want to deposit them in your storage and couldn't without disconnecting from the server or going to a new server worker, which would often result in your death, or you'd get distracted doing something else and die doing that. All in all, that was my biggest complaint. The biggest glitch for me was being unable to use the storage system. It just basically locked me out of a lot of the crafting side of the game. one of the tips for working around a lot of the issues and ashes for sure is use the page up on your keyboard. The page up key displays the server worker you're on, and by moving to a new server worker, you'll often find that the replication issues will actually go away. So then you can go to a new server, then return without having too much of an issue. And that way you don't have to disconnect to do the same thing. So use the page up key for the disconnect of that specific server worker by running to a nearby server worker. And the second glitch that I really found irritating was obviously the green mobs. Unable to attack them, they're able to farm you. Running in a group, we found a lot of green mobs, especially day one. It did decrease significantly by day two, but there was still plenty of issues. And I hope that one is also a priority to fix because it made a lot of the gameplay very difficult. You know, when you're running through an area and you just simply can't target, or half of your party can't target half the mobs, it makes it very difficult to focus on playing the game. You have to focus on how to avoid those mobs, or finding an entirely new area, or gamifying the system in some way, so that way that half of the party that can attack the mob can kill it, allowing it to respawn and hopefully not be green. Anyway, those are my thoughts regarding this Alpha 2. I hope you enjoyed them. I know it was a bit talky, but up next I'm going to do an interview section. I hope you guys enjoy it. There's going to be a lot of questions regarding Alpha 2, and yeah, welcome to my debriefing. What's up, VOX-OPS? Let's do some interview questions about Ashes of Creation. Let's begin.
How do you feel about the balance between exploration and combat in Ashes of Creation?
Well, Ashes of Creation is designed around an open world game. Anyone at any time can flag as a combatant and engage in PvP. So that means that anytime you're exploring, you always run the risk of combat. But Ashes of Creation does have some really good exploration systems. Between the varying nodes, biomes, the treasure hunter system, the players in game will have plenty of opportunity to explore the world of Vera. Not to mention, questing in Ashes of Creation is dynamic, and the various story arcs in Ashes of Creation will also bring players all over the world of Vera.
How important is dynamic weather and seasons to player immersion?
Well, dynamic weather is one of those systems that isn't needed, but provides a quality of life and immersion aspect to the game. I've heard really good things about the weather system. It has some really incredible effects. It really does bring the player into the game when they're playing. And I'm really looking forward to experiencing that in these future alpha tests. I think that it's one of those systems that didn't have to be included, but it's one of those small details that adds up over time. And like so many other parts of Ashes of Creation, they've really put a lot of thought into those small details. So I think it's a big part of it.
How does Ashes of Creation handle player choice compared to other MMOs?
Well, Ashes of Creation, in my opinion, has one of the most dynamic available world states for players to enjoy. In terms of player choice, there really isn't another game out there that provides more. Or plans to provide more. So between nodes, story arcs, castles, caravans, builds, the various weapons, and the class augment system, I think that Ashes of Creation has thousands of ways for players to enjoy different builds and create their own identity within the game. So I think it has an excellent design for that.
How do you expect the regional events, like node sieges, to shape player experience long term?
I think that the regional events like node sieges and castle sieges, node events, I think those are going to be extremely important to keeping players interested in the game. You know, one of the core loops of this game is going to be maintaining your node. And I think those node events like node sieges are going to be extremely valuable for players in terms of keeping their interest in the game. Nodes are going to be one of the areas that players spend the most time. So I think having those events, with how player driven they are, I think is going to be extremely fun. And I think it's going to be something that we all enjoy.
How intuitive did you find the skill progression compared to other games?
Honestly, it was extremely intuitive. Overall, it's just really easy to pick up one ability in an hour. And with the leveling curve in Ashes, you don't really like in some games you can level from 1 to 50 in 6 hours. In Ashes, it's going to take you potentially hundreds of hours. And in that time, you're going to gain one or two abilities a level. And that means you're going to spend significant time utilizing that ability before you level up again, which means the intuition factor for playing the game is already built in. You know, you're playing the game, you're going to be using your abilities and learning as you go. I think some things could use some work, like, you know, the crafting and stuff needs a little more fleshed out, but that is still, you know, very work in progress. So we'll see as we get later on into the game's development.
How does the game encourage diversity in player builds?
Well, honestly, the game encourages player diversity in player builds by providing tons of different scenarios for players to be effective. There isn't just one area where a player needs to succeed. There's player versus enemy, player versus player, raid bosses, sieges, massive combat scenarios, and each of those are going to have a different most effective build. Basically, in some cases, a player's spec might be optimal for a 3v3 or maybe an 8v8. In other cases, it may be optimal for farming mobs and raiding dungeons. And in other cases, it might be optimal for raiding large world bosses or huge PvP scenarios like node sieges. And each of those allow players to have an identity when they're crafting their class specs and really dive into unique build designs, which I'm really looking forward to seeing.
How do you feel about the game's death penalties and how they impact decision making?
Well, the game's death penalties honestly really sit in a very nice spot right now. When you die in the game, it does have an impact, but the impact isn't so severe that you feel like you need to slodge through, you know, hours of XP grind to get it off. It's largely a couple mobs and you're right back to where you were. But it does allow you to reflect after you die and go, what did I do wrong? How can I improve? And I think that's the perfect spot for XP debt to sit. Just enough to feel punishing, but not too much to make your day ruined if you die.
Do you think the corruption system will deter or encourage more meaningful PvP encounters?
Honestly, I think it'll do both. So it'll deter meaningless PK. In terms of you're out in the world, you're farming some trees, and somebody starts to attack your back. You know, in that case, it might be worthwhile to just let them go corrupt. Let yourself die, drop just some mats, and move on with your day. The corruption system in that case is going to punish the player through gear drops, XP debt, bounty hunters, and they're not going to be able to sell any of the stuff that they pick off you until they've worked off that debt. So I think largely the system will be great at deterring those that kind of gameplay. And in other cases, it'd be great at encouraging PvP. Because let's say you take that same crafter and they have a various number of heroic or legendary mats on them. They may not want to die. Or if they know they're gonna die, they may choose to flag so that way they lose less resources upon death. Since we know combatants lose half the number of mats that a non-combatant does upon death.
How important is social interaction to your experience in an MMO?
Honestly, it's extremely important to me. You know, the game is massively multiplayer online. A lot of MMOs that I've experienced in the past have not really taken that into account, and it's quite apparent in their game design and interactions. I think Ashes of Creation, focusing heavily on party gameplay and your interactions in the world as a part of a multiplayer experience, is extremely important to me. And it's absolutely why I showed up to this alpha, and honestly, it's definitely going to be why I continue to play in the future.
What type of player interactions do you think will define Ashes of Creation's community?
I think political strife in Ashes of Creation will be the driving force between most of the player interactions in the community. You know, after this singular phase 2 alpha, just fucking redo that part. Just redo it. Just redo it, brother. Redo it. I can edit this. We're editing it anyway, so I might as well do this one right. All right. Restarts.
What type of player interactions do you think will define Ashes of Creation's community?
Honestly, I think political strife will be a driving force in the interactions of the player community for Ashes of Creation. I think, viewing just this Alpha 2 Phase 1 weekend, we've seen a ton of political alliances forming, wars, enemies, all sorts of political strife. I think that kind of gameplay is going to be driving a lot of different interactions in the future. And I also think it's going to be very intriguing for players. When your node is on the line, your castle's on the line, your caravan's on the line, the XP that you're farming in an hour, or just rare mats that you're trying to get in the world, all of that being on the line is going to drive a ton of strife in game. And I think that is going to create the political landscape that keeps players in the game for a long time. I'm really looking forward to it.
Is there going to be a wipe system or something similar to renew content like other MMOs?
I think there's not going to be a wipe system like you're thinking of where the server starts from anew, or at least not very often. I'm sure they'll spin up new servers every once in a while. But largely, the design of Ashes of Creation is to allow players to have a in-game loop that is very consistent and fun. And the way they're doing that is by allowing node sieges to destroy an entire node, which if you're part of that node might mean you lose a ton of time and effort that you put into that node. But while that may sting, it'll also be a driving force for you going to a new node, creating political strife, like I mentioned earlier, and a whole bunch of other game dynamics that I look forward to enjoying. So I think overall, the game renewing won't actually start from fresh for every server wipe, but it will start from fresh in certain circumstances, like the node in your citizenry, or maybe your castle ownership, caravans, or freeholds.
Will the market be more player or NPC driven?
The market in Ashes of Creation is very player driven. So, one of the aspects of Ashes of Creation as a whole is that it's player driven, and the market's no different. Primarily, the nodes are leveled up through players acquiring experience in nearby areas or in the zone of influence of the node. But as a node levels, it has empty building plots for players to build new buildings that they want. Think like artisan buildings and crafting stations. Think in-node housing and various other economy-related buildings. Well, all of those buildings will require huge amounts of mats for players to bring in to the node so that way the mayor can build them. And I think that's going to be extremely player driven, with players bringing in caravans to finance those. Additionally, I think that there's going to be a ton of resource transport across the world of Vera, as resources have very specific spawn locations, and those resources then need to be transported across the world. That, combined with crafting being primarily player driven, I think nearly all aspects of the economy in Ashes of Creation will be player driven. There will be some NPC selling, but it's not going to be the primary.
How would you describe the learning curve in Ashes of Creation?
Honestly, the learning curve in Ashes of Creation is relatively straightforward. Now, there's a lot of depth to it, but generally speaking, hopping into the game and leveling gives you a good idea of the kind of gameplay experience. And, because of the duration that leveling takes, you gain one ability over an hour, and you spend that hour leveling that and learning that ability. I think that there's a lot of depth to the game. There's all sorts of status effects, all sorts of build designs, all sorts of different in-game mechanics that are all integrated that allow the player to have tons of skill expression in the game. But just picking up the game also provides a very playable experience. So overall, it's actually a very manageable skill curve. Very high, but not so steep that a player can't pick it up with ease.
How does the Trinity class system give players class identity without homogenization?
Well, the Trinity class system focuses on the idea of support, tank, and DPS as the three main roles in the game. And the Trinity class system in Ashes of Creation is going to have to go under a lot of different identity crisis. With the augment system being implemented and the 64 varying classes, allowing players to select roles like support and tank or DPS and support, this means there's going to be a lot of potential for class homogenization. Now, we haven't seen the augment system, so we don't know what that's going to look like. Additionally, it's important to note, Trumpet Studios has stated that they specifically want to avoid homogenization of the classes. So I expect that we'll get to see that later down the line, and I'm very excited for it in Phase 3 of the offer. All right, guys, that's it for my interview questions. Really appreciate you tuning in. Have a good one.